Alrighty, hello everybody, and thank you for joining us. This is Emily Shashelski on the line here, Channel Sales Manager with MicaSense, and I am joined today by my colleague Drew Bostian. Both of us will be going through 10 ways to use 10-band imagery. So we'll be taking the next 20 minutes to walk through the hardware of our new dual camera system, and then talk about some drone integration basics, processing, and then we'll go through some examples of applications for this new 10-band multispectral system. So I'm going to get started and dive right in. I've got the system here with me. So this is what it looks like in the hard carrying case it all comes in. And when you open it up, you can see there's the two sensors here, as well as a downwelling light sensor. So the downwelling light sensor component, those of you that are familiar with our RedEdge sensor and our Ultim sensor will be familiar with this component, but essentially it is there to geotag all of the images as well as to measure irradiance so we can do a good radiometric calibration. So really important since we're doing mapping applications here and we're comparing these maps over time to be able to calibrate the imagery. So looking at the sensors in depth here, you can see that it's two sensors combined actually, two cameras combined. We have our standard RedEdge-MX here, which has been around for about 6 years now. So we wanted to build off of the capabilities of this sensor and add 5 new multispectral bands. So that's what we have with the blue sensor here, is 5 new bands. We've added a new blue, a green, and 3 RedEdge bands. So combined, you've got the 10 multispectral band solution. The back here, we've connected the two with this mounting plate, and this circular piece here is the quick mount connector for DJI drones. So the integration is pretty simple. We offer integration kits for the Inspire 2 line and the whole Matrice line. So that includes Matrice 100, 600, and the 200 series. So this quick mount piece, you twist and lock onto the drone. It connects it to drone power, so you can power up the cameras, and then it connects with the DLS2 to power that as well. So we'll have, with this camera setup, there's 2 SD cards, which is where the TIFF files are stored. So we've got 5 from this one and 5 from this one. In post-processing, we align those bands and you get TIFF files 1 through 10 for each capture. I'll show the integration here briefly. We do have a Matrice 200 for an example here. And this is what it all looks like once it's integrated. So you can see the sensors on the bottom, they're stacked vertically. We know the locations of all of these imagers relative to each other so that we can do the alignment and post-processing. You can see the quick mount here is connected to the quick mount piece here is connected to the camera gimbal port on the drone, and then we connect the DLS2 here with this wire. So as far as assembly and disassembly, it's pretty easy. You just, there's a button here on the side that you can click and disconnect the camera, unplug the DLS2 cable, and then you can store the camera in its hard carrying case. Generally, you can keep the DLS2 installed and just keep that on the drone to make things a lot easier as far as transport. So that's the hardware itself. For post-processing, Pix4D Mapper and Agisoft Metashape are 2 that can process the 10-band imagery. So those are 2 that our customers are already generally familiar with. If you're not already familiar with our sensors, you might already be familiar with those processing softwares. So they're able to do the band alignment and then do the processing. And then you can run the analytics in something like a QGIS. So I will switch over to a graphic here next. We wanted to dive a little bit into why we chose the new 5 bands for the blue camera. So let me pull that up. All right, so we have this graphic here that kind of shows where the 10 bands line up on the electromagnetic spectrum. So in this boxed area on the graph, we have the MX camera, the standard red camera. that has the blue, green, red, red edge, and near infrared bands. And then below that is the new blue camera. So we've added the new 5 bands there. The blue camera is always intended to be paired with our MX. It's not meant to be a standalone product. And the reason that we did that is we wanted to make sure we were continuing to offer value to our current customers. So those where a 10-band solution is useful, they can now add a blue camera and upgrade their system. So that's an option for upgrade, as well as an option as just a full complete system for those that are already familiar with our sensors. So we're adding the value with the 2 5-band sensors. And then we also wanted to make sure we were aligning with satellite imagery, since we know satellites have been around a lot longer than this kind of drone-based remote sensing. So we wanted to be able to pull from that wealth of knowledge and the indices and composites that have been generated for specific applications using satellite imagery. So now with this drone-based option, there's a higher res, much higher spatial resolution, the ability to fly a lot more frequently. So good for people that either need the drone-based system to complement the satellite to be able to fly more frequently as required, or for those that want to use the drone as more of kind of a ground truthing tool to be able to validate a species classification map, for instance, and then scale that up to satellite to cover a large area. So opening up a lot more applications outside of agriculture with this dual band system. Our RedEdge and Ultim sensors have been primarily targeted at agricultural research. And so this kind of opens the door to more kind of water quality management applications as well as land management. So Drew will be going into that a bit more about the value of having these new RedEdge bands, for instance, and then we'll dive into some of the applications as well. So I'll hand it over to Drew.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. Yeah, so let's take a look first at just the 10 bands and how they relate to a plant reflectance profile. So on the left-hand side of the screen here, we've got a spot of a natural purification, water purification site that's in the state of Washington. We flew it with a 10-band camera, and what we're looking at here is actually a false color composite of the 3 RedEdge bands that are occurring in the 10-band camera. So 405, 705, 717, and 740. And so there's value associated with having those 3 RedEdge bands because I'm not going to go into a lot of details on this, but when you're doing physiological research on a plant canopy, or you're doing phenotyping work, understanding the position of that RedEdge slope is very important as it relates to chlorophyll concentration and just how the plant is going through photosynthetic activity. So if you look at the right side of the screen, we're showing those 3 RedEdge bands. I'll just kind of go through it. So the blue image, the blue line is representing 705, the green is 717, and then the red is 740. And then the white line within this this graph is what's occurring in this particular data set as it relates to like a typical plant canopy reflectance profile. So in some of our marketing materials, you see that reflectance profile where it's like low reflectance at blue, it comes up a little bit at green, it goes down again at red where it absorbs a lot of red light for photosynthesis, and then it starts climbing into the red edge and then into near infrared. In this image, this is essentially the plant reflectance profile that's created by capturing those 10 reference points with the dual band camera. So you can kind of see it where it's grabbing those points. So if you're on the very far left side, you can see where 444 is at, and then you move a little bit to the right and you see the 475, and the line changes, and then it goes up to 531, and then you see another change, and then 560, and then it goes down to 650, and then it changes very, very slightly, and then goes into 668, then up to 705, and 717, and 740, and then 840. So I wanted to point that out just because if you think about what that line would look like if we only had 5 spectral bands, it would be much more coarse. You would have kind of much less of a reference or understanding of what's going on as it relates to the plant's reflectance profile. This analogy kind of popped in my head when I was looking at this. So I was doing taxes over the weekend, and I had to find my kids' social security numbers, and I was noticing how much different their social security numbers were than mine. And it's because there's 9 digits, and so if we only had 4 digits in our social security numbers, there'd be a much higher percentage of those being very similar to each other. Because we have 9 numbers, they're all very different. And so that's kind of the way you can look at it here is, if we want to distinguish from plants or different surface areas from other surface areas, having 10 reference points makes it much less likely that we're going to get similar values because we have 10 different points of reference. So maybe that resonated with you. It resonated with me. We can go to the next slide. So in this same natural water purification location, we're going to clip out this piece of water and take a look at that a little more closely. So the red outline box, I think on the next slide we'll see some information on that. So what's crazy about this is the left side image and then the right side image are actually the same location. And what we're looking at here is essentially a false color composite of the 444 blue, the 475 blue, and then the 531 green. And so down in the center box, you'll see the blue line representing the 444, and then reflectance increases a little bit to 475, and then it drops a little bit again to 531. So before we look at the images too much, I just wanted to point out that the 444 it's a lower reflectance than the 475. So that blue line is about 700 maybe. The green line is more like 780. And so that's just kind of pointing out the fact that we chose this 444 to be included in the 10-band sensor because a lot of people have been asking us for that for water analysis, because that 444 is penetrating water and it allows us to see better the reflectance information of contents that are in that water. So it's getting absorbed by the water, but then objects in the water are causing things to be reflected. What we did here, left side versus right side, is we essentially looked at the scatter plot that you're seeing at the top of where the pixel values were occurring for those 2 blue bands, 444 and 475. And we essentially just looked at those values and we got rid of all the other values across that entire orthomosaic that you saw in the previous image. And so we got rid of all the other values that were probably much different than these, like I think there was a building roof and some cars and some plant canopies. So we got rid of that and we just isolated the water. And because the data is 16-bit data, we got 32,000 possible values, and we basically just narrowed it down to about 3,000. And then we stretch that histogram out, and it allows us to much more clearly see variability in an image that looks very homogeneous, like what you see on the left side of the screen. So just kind of an interesting example of some ways you can manipulate the data. So a few more points on water analysis. What we're looking at here is the Gulf of Mexico, and we're looking at where the Mississippi River drains into the Gulf of Mexico. And you're seeing all these like plumes of stuff that's happening in the water, kind of the turquoise color, and that's actually harmful algae bloom that's occurring. And so what's actually happening here is in the spring, after farmers in the Midwest are putting on all kinds of nutrients on their fields, like nitrogen and potassium or phosphorus, sometimes we get a ton of rain in the spring, and that rain causes a bunch of leaching of those nutrients and runoff that occurs off those fields in the Midwest, which drain into creeks, which drain into the Mississippi River. The river carries those nutrients down into the Gulf of Mexico, and it causes this algae bloom, this harmful algae bloom. And so it really disrupts the ecosystem down there. And as you can see, it can be pretty widespread. So this, of course, is satellite imagery, and we would never use the dual cam on such a wide or such a large area or at such a high AGL. But what's true about this is that along this coastline are several natural preserves, several probably state parks, and people at those locations are very concerned about how such an algae bloom is going to impact the local ecosystem. And so those types of people we're seeing adopting the dual cam system, you know, and the RedEdge and the Altum to a certain extent as well. But with the 444 band, they're able to see, you know, how this larger event is happening their local ecosystem at a much higher GSD with the dual cam system. So, and then the next slide is a similar example of, and this is actually manned aircraft on Lake Erie, but we're using that blue band again to see a harmful algae bloom. And so what happens in Lake Erie that's kind of interesting is apparently Lake Erie is the smallest of the Great Lakes, and it's also the shallowest of the Great Lakes. And other than the southern part of Lake Michigan, it's the southernmost Great Lake as well. So that makes it generally warmer water than the other Great Lakes, which is good for algae bloom, harmful algae bloom. And then another thing that's kind of interesting is there's a river called the Maumee River that runs through Indiana and Ohio and picks up nutrients from all that farmland and dumps it into Lake Erie as well. So it's just kind of a perfect scenario for this harmful algae bloom that affects fish and tourism, local ecosystems, as you can imagine. And kind of similarly to the previous example, we're not targeting mapping of the entire Great Lake, but these are the kind of events that happen that impact local, really regional areas where government entities are very concerned about how these unnatural events are impacting the local environment. So again, those are kind of the people that are adopting this technology and using it for local mapping with the blue band. And then again, we're looking at this is a reservoir in Oklahoma, and these people are essentially trying to eradicate a weed that's damaging the reservoir. And if you look in the coves in the north side of this image, you see this kind of neon green colors. And what that is that's a weed, that's an aquatic weed that they're trying to eradicate. And so if we go to the next slide, what they did was they applied a herbicide application to kill this noxious weed and try to eradicate it from the reservoir. And looking at satellite imagery, it's pretty difficult to see the effectiveness of the herbicide application. So you can see the satellite image on the left, it's pretty low in GSD, but then they mapped the image with a RedEdge, and they actually came up with a custom composite for this that really helped delineate between the weeds and the water that they were not able to get from the satellite imagery. And what it essentially told them was, like, there were areas where, I guess in the satellite imagery, the weeds still look pretty good, but with the drone-based imagery, with a custom composite of, I think it was 432, RedEdge, red and green, they were able to see where the weeds were dying and were falling to the bottom of the lake. And then they were also seeing areas where maybe their herbicide application wasn't really being effective. So this is a good example of just like a really unique application for multispectral imagery that may require customization of a composite or indices that are best suited for that particular situation. And so with the 10-band camera, kind of like what I was talking about before early, where we have 10 reference points, it just opens up the possibilities for finding the perfect composite or index for your particular project. And then one more slide on water before we move on to some more agricultural and conservation applications. So I was talking with a RedEdge user a few weeks ago, and he was talking about a pier that was being built on the coastline, and he was part of sort of like a regulatory group for the local ecosystem, and their job was to see how the pier construction was impacting, in this case, desirable algae species. And the algae species was very sensitive to changes in the depth of the water. And so as the construction was going on of the pier, it was possible that that was going to impact the depth of the water, which would in turn affect the algae in that region. So they were basically just using the higher GSD to really see how that construction was impacting the local environment. Another thing that's sort of on the regulatory side is that we've been talking with some people in the industry about dredging, and apparently there's a lot of there is some regulatory there are some regulations around how much sediment is being kicked up during dredging and how that impacts the environment as well. And so again, just with that 444 band, if you're doing dredging work, and there are local restrictions on the amount of sediment that's being kicked up and how that's impacting the local environment, the
Looks like Drew is frozen there. Give it a second. See if he's able to join back. Okay, so I'll pick it up from here. So this next slide, we're showing a map. This is a RedEdge map. And this was generated flying over bananas. So the RGB composite you can see here looks pretty uniform. And the example we wanted to show here is the value of having different bands to do different false color composites. So we've got the RGB composite here, and then we switch to a false color composite, and all of a sudden you're able to see a lot more variation in the vegetation here. Specifically in the upper left-hand corner of the image, you can see an area that's a light green color that stands out pretty starkly from the surrounding. And so that area was identified as some plants that were infected with black sigatoka, which is a leaf spot disease that is really terrible and something that's really threatening the banana industry. So this was something where they were able to identify, using the 5 bands on RedEdge, the fungal infection. However, it was at a stage where it was too far gone to really take any action. So this is something where they're continuing, ongoing research to see. At the time that they were flying, the dual band system, the dual camera system was not available. So it's something that they're going to be investigating further to see if having in the additional bands, you're able to pick up on those subtle changes in reflectance much earlier on in the infection to be able to do early detection and take action. All right, and this example takes us into more of a land management application. So here, this is actually Ultim Imagery. This is a case study we recently published on our blog. We have some customers up in Canada that are doing reclamation work. So reclamation for both mining, oil and gas exploration, as well as forestry is a really interesting application for the 10-band system. In this case, the dual band system was not available as they were flying, but it's something that they're very interested in utilizing this season. specifically because the main application here is that they're doing a species classification map. So with this false color composite, you can see there's a lot of variation between the dark pinks to the purples to the greens, showing the different types of shrubs and trees and other vegetation in the image. So this is something where they're using the high resolution drone-based imagery. Then they're correlating that with some ground truthing to figure out the legend for the species classification map. And then ultimately they'll be scaling this up to satellite imagery. So that's another reason that they're very interested in the dual camera system, is that they're using Sentinel, I believe. So the 10-band system correlates quite well with the bands on Sentinel, and it's something they can use very well to continually scale up their investigation of how effective are these reclamation efforts in restoring these areas that have been surface mined to the natural species composition of the surrounding, uninterrupted areas. So reclamation applications, in this case, the more of the mining application, but also applicable to forestry. MicaSense is located in Seattle. The Pacific Northwest has lots of timber industry around here. And as they're cutting down areas, these companies are needing to replant, reseed the areas where they've cut down the trees. And then they're going back, at 2 years, 7 years, 10 years to monitor the effectiveness of that replanting to see, are these trees surviving? If not, does another species need to be planted? Maybe in an area that's pretty waterlogged, something that's more hardy and not going to get a root rot disease, things like that. So for the monitoring efforts of the reclamation and the reseeding, really helpful to have the aerial imagery to see the, how well that the vegetation is surviving, but also what the species composition is. And then we'll close out with this last example here. This is dual camera imagery. You may have seen it in some of the publications about the dual camera system. But this is a farm located near us in Washington. They've got a small area of planted in the left-hand side where you can see there's multiple different kinds of crops planted there. This was in the fall, so it's kind of later on. But right next to it is a river, and you can see a lot of the riparian habitat surrounding the river, as well as like a sandbank. So this is a really good example in showing how these additional bands with the 10-band system are great for the species classification mapping. So here we've selected this is all using new 3 bands from the new blue camera, a false color composite. And then the next slide shows what the resulting species classification map would look like. So this is something we'll be releasing a tutorial on, I believe, on our blog very soon, on how we were able to generate this. But essentially, you can see in the legend there, we've kept it pretty general. We're showing sand versus soil versus, for the vegetation, dead vegetation versus healthy versus crops. So this is something where once this classification is made, using some ground truthing data to fill in the blanks of what these specific species are. But really helpful for looking at land management applications, whether looking at environmentally sensitive areas, and if it's either an NGO or a government agency that wants to be tracking the species composition in that environmentally sensitive area over time. We've already seen some of that with some of our RedEdge users. For instance, we have a researcher flying up in Antarctica, who is flying an environmentally protected area that has specific species of lichen and moss. So they wanted to map not only the digital surface model of that area, but also the species composition and the vegetation cover of the lichen and moss. So that's something that they were able to generate the cover with the RedEdge, but not necessarily the species classification of specific species of lichen versus the moss. So something that they would be able to do with the 10-band system. So mapping the environmentally sensitive areas. Also, a great application is looking at invasive species. That's something that in a lot of places people struggle with. I know around here blackberries are a big issue. So being able to find the specific spectral response of that invasive species so that you can do repetitive maps and show over time how effective are these eradication efforts that groups are doing to get rid of this species so that the native species can thrive. And if current methods aren't working, how can they be adapted? So a great tool for monitoring. All right, so that is the last example. We went right up to time here with the 30 minutes. So we'll just take a couple of minutes for questions, and then any that we're not able to answer, we can follow up with you directly. And that would go for any additional questions that come up. You can always email Drew or I, and we're happy to answer. So let's see what questions we have here. Okay, so someone planning to use the DJI Matrice 210 to detect algal blooms in a reservoir, wanting to know whether to use our 5-band RedEdge or the dual camera system, and the difference between the two. So yeah, that's an interesting one, looking at algal blooms. Drew got to mention that in one of his examples. The advantage of the 10-band system there is the 444, the coastal blue band that he mentioned. That one's really good for penetrating the water. So it will depend a little bit on what the water and other kind of vegetation surrounding is in that area. I know in the example that we've got up here of that reservoir with the the floating weed that's floating on the water surface, that lake was, if you look in the RGB, the water's quite brown and dark green in some areas. So it was very difficult to, just looking at RGB, to separate water pixels from vegetation pixels. So having the, in this case, the false color composite using the 3 bands we mentioned was useful. In other cases, it'll be helpful to have that 444 blue band that will be able to better penetrate the water, so you can see vegetation versus water, but also especially what's suspended in the water. So if there's sediment suspended in the water or the phytoplankton, to be able to identify that as well. So as far as looking at substances suspended in the water, the blue band on the 444 is helpful. So that comes with the dual band system. And then, do our sensors work on the Wingtra VTOL? Wingtra does carry the RedEdge. It does not carry the dual camera system. They are working on, I believe they're working on an Ultim integration as well. If you're interested in flying on a VTOL with a dual camera system, you can let us know. Right now, the only VTOL that I know of that carries that is the Quantum Trinity. And then Pixbirdie Mapper does process not only for dual band but for all of our sensors. Edgesoft Metashape as well, as far as software options. Can I integrate the RedEdge-MX Blue upgrade kit with the Ultim? No, so we only have the integration for the dual camera system with RedEdge, and that has to do with how we set up the firmware and set it up for the RedEdge camera to be the master and trigger the blue camera. So for now, yes, we just have the RedEdge cameras available for this configuration.
Looks like one of the questions is any of this work published? And the one about the oil sand one in Canada that you mentioned, Emily, that one is at blog.micasense.com in case studies. And then the other one of the Oklahoma example of the weeds in the water, that one's also going to be published soon, correct?
Yeah, that'll be coming on in a couple of weeks. That'll be on our blog as well.
And there's another question, a pretty long question, relating to radiometric calibration, I think, and just like what's kind of the error of that radiometric calibration. Our panels are pretty good. So with the camera comes the calibrated reflectance panel, and I can't remember specifically what the error is, but I think it's somewhere between like 5 and 2.5% off of like actual. So it's gonna be good for the majority of our customers. If you're looking for like super precision on the radiometric side of things and needs a panel that's more precise, I think there are companies out there that offer more scientific grade panels, but for the most part, our panels are going to be sufficient.
One question about Ultim used at lower altitude in greenhouses or for vegetables, herb crops. We have seen RedEdge, not specifically Ultim, but RedEdge has been used in greenhouses, and that's primarily researchers that are both flying in the field and doing imaging in the greenhouse. So you can do close range capture with our sensors. The main consideration is that you won't be able to align the bands. There's parallax issues doing that since the subject that you're imaging is so close to the sensor itself. But if you wanted to look at a single TIFF file analysis, you'd be able to do that.
There's one more question that I think is we should get to, and it's would this dual camera system be useful for distinguishing and classifying different species of weeds in agricultural crops? We currently use 5-band, but this isn't always sufficient for classification workflows. Wow, it's like that question was planted for us to answer. It's so yeah, the 10-band system, we see it as very good for classification for those kind of applications. So there's a case study on that as well in the blog.MicaSense page that I recommend you checking out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one we're excited about as far as agricultural applications, because you can look at using a false color composite, you can generally tell like a broadleaf weed from the planted crop, intended crop. But if you've got multiple broadleaf weeds or different varieties, and they both have different either herbicides or different removal techniques for them, helpful to distinguish those different species. So if they generally have a higher chlorophyll content, can't really rely on just a chlorophyll map for that or a CIR composite. So having the additional RedEdge bands from the dual camera system is helpful there.
We've got a ton more questions, but maybe we should close this up and just take those offline.
We're a little bit over time, so yeah, I think we'll follow up with, if you submitted a question, we'll be sure to follow up with you directly via email. And we will have a recording of this webinar, so if any of your colleagues weren't able to join, no worries. We will be emailing you as soon as the recording is available, and it will be available on YouTube. Alrighty. Well, thank you everybody so much for your time.
There's one last thing on the last slide, right?
Yes. Let me see. Pull that up. So that's our contact information if you want to follow up with us with more questions. Also, we do have a special offer for everybody that has attended the webinar today. So if you are interested in a sensor purchase, you can get a 5% discount off of that purchase by contacting us directly, and that offer does expire on the 14th. Alrighty. Well, thanks so much everybody for your time, and really appreciate it, and we'll be following up with the recording of this webinar.